I'm Jagjit Singh Srai from the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to be talking about policy interventions in food supply chains and some research we've undertaken on the role of farmer producer organizations and digital platforms on bargaining power and equity. So the context here is that there's new farming laws being developed in India that has affected Indian national farming landscape, and also some farming initiatives taken at the state level by the Punjab government. Well, we really wanted to look at what were the implications of these new farm laws. Now, the picture there is of some mass protests that were taken over the course of the last 1.5 years, really looking at the protests were against the federal policy development. But I'll talk first really around the state policy. Here, through stakeholder engagement facilitated by the Tigress project, some formal policy inputs were made to the state government, and indeed they were adopted. So there's a Punjab policy notification issued based on that workshop collaboration between Punjab Agricultural University and the University of Cambridge. And we wanted to contrast these with the federal policy development. We started to create new markets. There were 3 new farm bills, and they were roundly perceived as having limited farmer consultation. And as many of you will know, mass protests resulted. Some argue the largest protest in history, involving more than 1 million people at one point protesting against these federal farm bills. But what we wanted to do was really understand what were the likely implications of the state policy and the federal policy on retail power and farmer livelihoods, which is a core aim of the Tigress project. So our research goal was examining the impact of competing and coexisting policies in supply chains. Now, as an aside, this scenario of competing policy contexts comes up in many supply chain contexts. In the UK and Europe, this tension between the nation state and the European state. In pharmaceuticals, where you have different federal policies, depending on which region you're operating. We see this in global supply chains linked to logistics. In aviation, different parts of the world have their own regulatory requirements. And even energy policies within for example, the United States on renewables, solar power, and so on. You'll see different policies operating at the same time across different states. So in our research approach on the Indian and Punjab context, we undertook some significant field interviews. We organized some quite substantive workshops, and this allowed us to really start to do some supply chain mapping. Here we developed a new configuration mapping method, developed to assess inequities across supply chain ecosystems. And then we undertook some simulations of the decisions and outcomes. And it allowed us to explore the potential for applying this new mapping method and analytics to broader ecosystems to address equity issues, particularly when new digital business models are introduced. Now, looking at the existing situation, we used our methodology to look at a process which we've now termed supply chain netting. This is mapping financial flows, net financial flows, and the imbalance indicators for the various sectors. So in this diagram, you will see in the black arrows demonstrating the material flows between the farmers, the artiyas, the mandi, and state and federal government actors. We can also see in green the financial flows, and indeed the information flows that allow farmers to understand the demand requirements for food security. Now, supply chain netting was particularly helpful by starting to look at where the inventory sits. So in this current state model situation before the new farm laws, is you saw inventory held at the mandi, held in some in processing plants, but predominantly held centrally for public distribution. Now, this allowed us to expand and understand, what was the boundary of that supply chain and track the impact on state government and federal government, the impact on suppliers, farmers, and retailers. What were the financial flows through banks? What were their contracting arrangements with the Food Corporation? And this allowed us to really map out both inventory flows and likely social outcomes, such as who's holding inventory for food security. And it's to this new mapping methodology that we applied our analytics to address equity metrics, alongside the conventional profit and risk metrics you would look at in the supply chain. Now, we ascertained in this process, where the inventory pools were located, how demand and supply information signals reached the conventional marketplace, which is the mandi. So the real gap here is who wants what in terms of equity issues, and how do tensions arise. So we need to build on this supply netting map to start to look at revised mapping of the ecosystem in the new context. So the first thing we look at, the existing system versus the proposed federal leverage of the new farm bills that were introduced by the central federal government. And here you see the two maps now. Again, you've got the farmer, the mandi system, and the state and federal actors. But here, in the diagram on the right, you see how the federal farm bill will start to introduce, in addition to the RTAs that support the mandi systems, the unregulated agents and the direct buyer, and a real expansion of storage, processing, and retail. You see the inventory flows now are held at the retail level, something that was not possible previously. So in looking at the changes, the reconfigurations that might take place, is you have an established marketplace, the mandi, moving to a competing marketplace, where the mandi system would be operating at the same time, simultaneously, with the new proposed federal farm bills. So part of our analysis was also looking at the simulation model of the ecosystem. And in simplified form, it's presented here. You see a number of flows here, the input side bargaining power, which really looks at supply side bargaining. You start to look at output side bargaining power, and this is the demand side bargaining. And then you've got these learning loops that would start to build as, for example, FPOs develop scale. And that starts to improve margins and the desire to improve scope through learning. We'll start to look at some of the impacts of moving to a farmer-producer organization. You see on the left-hand side also the digital platform. And this really gives us a leveraging option, as it allows us to build scale through the system. So how would the new proposed farmer-producer organizations, also within a digital platform context, play out? And here we've got the reconfigured system. Into the mandi system that we currently have, you would get a reconfigured marketplace with some self-financing, for FPOs with own assets, acting as both buying and selling agents, investing in processing, storage, and retail operations. And it certainly started to give us a scenario where inventory was held both by FPOs and downstream retail. And we started wanting to look at what was the impact on material, financial, information flows. Where was the inventory going to sit? And how did this play out in terms of equity and bargaining power? So you can see the new reconfigured marketplaces. Now, this table really summarizes the 4 scenarios that we were looking at. And let me introduce the table first. The 4 columns on the right, looking at the Mundi system, the federal leverage, the new farm bills that were introduced by the central government, the farmer producer organizations, and the 4th scenario really around FPOs as digital platforms. So how do they FPOs at scale, if you like? So if you look at the farmer equity and bargaining power, we term the Mundi system as the current state as neutral. Under the federal leverage new farm bills, we see farmers having reduced equity and reduced bargaining power. In the FPO model, scenario 3, through self-regulated systems, you see an enhanced equity and bargaining power. And under the digitally powered digital platform oriented FPO, we perhaps see the most positive scenario for farmers with enhanced equity and bargaining power that's digitally enabled. Now, this chart shows the impact on the other key actors. So intermediaries, the RTOs were in the regulated Mundi system doing well. In the unregulated, they perhaps do even better. The intermediaries in this case, not the formalized RTOs. In the FPO model, they are disintermediated and have a smaller role, and similarly in the 4th scenario. Again, in the major retail, you see not really existing in the current state Mundi system, but in the federal leverage, having significant enhanced bargaining power, which is now more balanced in the FPO scenarios. Now, if we look at the broader state and federal government, you can see where the equity and welfare implications are. So we are somewhat concerned that under the federal leverage laws that were proposed, that this is a negative impact at the state level and possibly at the federal level too. But under the FPO models, you see positive outcomes, both for local government and more widely. So we wanted to take this research and generalize it to broader settings. And here in this table, we look at the impact on supply chain interests and across policymakers' interest on when policies are aligned and when they are competing. So in the conventional case, you see supply chain interests and policy interests fully aligned, and it's the conventional situation. But when policymakers' interests are competing, we see equity and bargaining power between states taking place. That's in the bottom right. When supply chain interests are competing, top left, we see equity and bargaining taking place between supply chain actors and intermediaries. So you start to get a shift in the bargaining power. And when you have both competing in the top right, it opens up new research areas around what are the mechanisms in this complex scenario. Is there double bargaining taking place, double marginalization, and what are the role of intermediaries when you have these competing supply chain interests, policymaker interests due to different policies. Now, this scenario plays out in other sectors as well, aviation, biopharma, energy, indeed recreational drugs, where you can have different laws in different territories that can result in these outcomes. So very much in our top right, we see business model assessment options incorporating both equity and environmental, social, and governance issues can be addressed. So this is a bit of an innovation in terms of looking at supply chain in that broader ESG context. So to wrap up, we were really looking at how different policy impacts supply chain configurations, how digital platforms might enhance the situation. And here you see one of the workshops that was conducted in March 2020 around these new farmer producer organization innovations. So here the state policy had quite extensive stakeholder engagement and formal policy input generation and adoption. And we were delighted to see the Punjab policy notification that resulted from this level of engagement and analysis. This research has been presented at several international conferences, informs and POMs in particular. And our data collection and modeling work really was needed to put specificity in the findings. Now, the output of this work has in the Journal of Production and Operations Management, a major journal within the supply chain field, titled Interplay Between Competing and Coexisting Policy Regimens within Supply Chain Configurations. It's also been a top 10 SSRN research paper downloaded during the formulation of the paper, perhaps showing the wider interest in this type of research. My thanks to my colleagues, Nitin Jaglekar from Boston University, and Naomi Tsalakis from Cambridge, and Sandeep Kapoor from Punjab Agricultural University. Thank you very much. Do reach out if you'd like to learn about our work. Thank you.